The New Deal, Part 2. The New Deal still resonates with the American people, both in terms of those who now at the end of their lives lived through it, or it was very much a part of their lives when they were young adults. And also in history and political commentary, the New Deal is constantly referenced. I was watching one of the major cable news organizations the other day, Saturday I think it was, and the commentators came on and they just savaged Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, arguing that it was socialism. Hopefully, you remember that I told you specifically that Roosevelt was not a socialist. Does that mean that he was static, that the country wasn't moving towards socialism on Roosevelt's watch? No. Some of the things he did moved the country closer to socialism. You need to think of the political spectrum as one big continuum with communism on the radical left and free enterprise capitalism, no regulation whatsoever on the far right. At least that's the way I place it. And then everybody is somewhere in the middle there, depending on what kind of government programs, controls, and so forth that they prefer. So you're somewhere on that line, right? And Roosevelt certainly moved the country towards socialism, but he was not a socialist. There's a very clear definition as to what socialism is, and he doesn't meet it. So those commentators on that network were advancing a point of view for their own political purpose. They wanted somebody or the viewers to think that Roosevelt was a socialist so that they would go, oh no, we don't like that. We hate Roosevelt, right? So everything's political in one way or another. Everything's political, okay? But you have to know the terminology. So, the election of 1936. A few historians have argued that the New Deal was not very successful. It's a political point of view. But the American people believed otherwise. In 1932, when Roosevelt was first elected, the American people voted against the Republican Herbert Hoover. He was the president associated with the Great Depression. But in 1936, after 4 years of Roosevelt, they voted for Franklin Roosevelt. In that year, Roosevelt forged a new political coalition that would last an entire generation. Farmers of the West and the South, beneficiaries of AAA, voted for Roosevelt. They thought that AAA was great, the vast majority of them. Ethnic groups of the northern cities, the immigrants, they voted for Roosevelt because of New Deal programs. Labor, those men and women who worked in the great factories, they voted for Roosevelt because of the improvement in the economy and the federal government's support for labor unions. Middle class voters whose homes and businesses had been saved by New Deal low interest loans, many of them voted for Roosevelt. And blacks, to this day, switched their votes from the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party, the party that had broken the shackles of slavery in 1865. When blacks could vote from 1865 on to 1936, and it wasn't very often, of course, in the South because they'd been disenfranchised, right, by white supremacists. But when they could vote, they voted Republican. They paid that debt of thanks to Abraham Lincoln and his party. But in 1936, that all changed, and it's changed again to this day. Because of New Deal programs, most of which were colorblind. Blacks benefited from New Deal programs, and so they switched their vote from the Republicans to the Democrats, and the vast majority of blacks vote Democratic to this day. And so Franklin Roosevelt created this coalition of voters that again would last an entire generation. Pretty much until Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. Doesn't mean that Democrats won every election, they didn't, but that coalition was pretty solid. In addition to the black vote, Roosevelt captured the cities. The great urban areas, again, to this day, vote Democratic, and Roosevelt captured 104 of the 106 largest cities in America in 1936. It's the towns and villages and the rural areas that voted Republican. And that is still the same. The Republican Party had largely become the party of big business, and those Americans who philosophically simply thought, and this is their politics now, simply thought that the active use of government, the way that Roosevelt intended to do it, and did do it, was too much, that government should not do that much. The taxes should be lower, there should be more freedom for business people, and so forth. And again, that's the same today. The Republican Party in 1936 ran a little-known politician from the state of Kansas, right in the middle of the heartland, right? Republican, red state, Kansas. His name was Alf Landon. He was so little known that when Roosevelt campaigned, he didn't even mention the name of his opponent because he didn't want the voters to actually learn his name. And for decades, politicians would follow that little lesson in how to get elected. Don't mention the name of your opponent if you're much more well-known than they are. Why give them that free publicity? On the eve of the election, by 1935, the National Recovery Administration was a clear failure. It was not working. And the Supreme Court came along and declared it unconstitutional. Now, instead of revising the National Recovery Administration, as he might have done to get around the Supreme Court's ruling, Franklin Roosevelt called a new play. He said, it's not working anyway, the court has killed it, we're going to call a new play. He decided now to engage in even more deficit spending. What's deficit spending? Yeah, spending money you don't have, you're borrowing it, okay? Every time you use your Visa card and you don't have money in the bank, you're deficit spending. Somebody's got to pay that back. The federal government can spend money like that, create money like that, in the hopes that it will energize the economy, right? Okay. And so Roosevelt then, instead of reinvigorating NRA or creating another agency that would do similar things, decided simply to spend more money, pumping money into the economy. You would think that he would simply put more money into something like PWA, and that would have made sense, but Roosevelt decided not to. He created another agency. This, of course, is bedeviling students ever since, because students have to learn another acronym. And this one's confusing because PWA was already there. That's the big works projects like Grand Coulee Dam and so forth. So Roosevelt created in 1935 to help spend this money the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. So you have PWA, you have WPA, and it's all confusing. And I'm not going to try to trick you up on this on a test. These are both agencies that put Americans to work. They are the conduit by which Roosevelt spent money to put Americans to work and to build things, okay? There were some differences, but those are the kinds of differences that should bedevil historians and not undergraduate students. So he created the Works Progress Administration, and WPA alone, over the next 8 years, spent $11 billion. That was a lot of money in those days, and put 8 million men to work on these kinds of projects. And so in the election campaign of 1936, Franklin Roosevelt then tours the country, and he heard the appreciation of the American people. We know that Roosevelt was popular. We know that the American people believed the New Deal was working. How do we know that? Because every 4 years we have a referendum, don't we? We have an election. And if the American people are not happy, they vote the other way and they throw the rascal out. That's what happened to Herbert Hoover. But if they are happy, if they're confident that the president knows what he's doing, then they'll keep him in for another 4 years. And in Roosevelt's case, they'll keep him in for another 12 years. altogether. Well, 13 when you get all said and done, right? They just kept electing him. And you're saying to yourself, wasn't that unconstitutional? No. More about that later. It was not unconstitutional then. It was unprecedented, but not unconstitutional. And so he toured the country and he heard the American people in their appreciation. He would stop and he would speak to the people, and Americans would call out to him, "He saved my farm. He saved my house." You see, because of government programs that allowed for people to borrow money at low interest rates and pay the mortgages. God bless President Roosevelt. No wonder that FDR was elected in 1936. He won all but 2 states, way up there in New England, Maine and Vermont. Look at that map. That's not fake news, folks. That's the election of 1936. That is a landslide. All kinds of synonyms for landslide, but that's the favorite political terminology. We could call it a butt kicking, a slapdown. Whatever it is, Roosevelt is president for 4 more years, and the American people are thrilled over that. Okay. As far as they're concerned, the judgment of history is that the New Deal worked. Historians can say whatever they want. Economists can say whatever they want. There's the map. But an election like that is probably going to go to a president's head, right? Which brings us to the court packing plan. Exultant with his victory, FDR claimed in his second inaugural address that our progress out of the Great Depression is obvious, and it was. That's why he was reelected. Things are so much better in 1936 than they were in 1932. But keep in mind, the Depression is not over. We have not climbed economically back to what we were in 1929, but the progress is clear, you see. But the Depression is not over. And so Roosevelt declares the New Deal is not finished. In this great address, he said, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clothed, and ill-nourished." So in his second administration, he wants to address that third of a nation that hasn't, in his mind, been helped enough. Now, the Supreme Court had become the clear enemy of the New Deal. It had struck down NRA. Roosevelt wasn't too upset about that. As we've seen, it wasn't working anyway. It was a good way to get rid of NRA. All right. But it had also struck down AAA, and AAA was popular and it was working. And so instead of junking AAA, Roosevelt reconfigured it and put it back to work, and so it continued to assist farmers. I'm not going to ask you about the details of that. But other New Deal programs like Social Security were working their way through the courts. And what if the Supreme Court then, when those cases finally arrived there in front of the bench, struck down Social Security like it had NRA? Would the court, very conservative court now, would it strike down the entire New Deal at some point? That was Roosevelt's concern. So the court was the enemy. And so now Roosevelt came up with the idea of adding Supreme Court justices to the 9 who already sat on the bench. The new justices would, of course, be appointed by Roosevelt. It's the president who appoints federal judges. And they would obviously be appointed because they were what? Sympathetic to the New Deal. That's the whole point. So these new votes, these new justices then would prevent the court from declaring the New Deal unconstitutional. This is called the court packing plan. We're going to pack the court with new judges, all favorable to the New Deal. There was precedent for FDR's ideas. Congress, not the Constitution, this will probably come as a surprise, sets the number of justices. The Constitution does not say that there shall be 9 Supreme Court justices. In the past, there had been 5, changed by Congress. There had been 10. There had been 7. Now there were 9. To make the change more palatable to Congress, Roosevelt argued that many of the judges on the court were very old and incapable of keeping up with the work requirements on the court. They need help. Only the very naive would believe this. But a lot of the American people are relatively naive. So, Roosevelt was surprised when his own party gagged on the so-called court-packing plan. The Democrats, you would think the Democrats would be all for the court-packing plan. We're going to appoint Democratic judges. But no, there was great respect for the independence of the court on both parties. And it seemed that even to Democrats, that if Roosevelt were able to put more judges on the court for political reasons, that would make Roosevelt essentially a dictator. One Democratic legislator said, boys, Democrat now, this is where I cash in my chips. I'm not going to support this. It looked there for a while that Roosevelt might get an extra judge or 2, but then, you see, the Supreme Court does not operate in a vacuum. The judges read the newspapers. They see what's going on. And amazingly, the Supreme Court started finding, while this was all going on, the Supreme Court started finding New Deal agencies and programs constitutional. And so the Supreme Court packing plan does not pass. It didn't have to. The court has changed its mind. People did not realize it at the time, though, but there would be no more New Deal programs. The court-packing plan meant the end of New Deal programs. It didn't mean the end of the New Deal programs that had already been passed, okay? One of those was Social Security. Do we still have Social Security? Absolutely we do, okay? So don't be confused. It just meant that Roosevelt's not going to get any more New Deal programs through Congress, okay? Because of the court-packing plan. A lot of Democrats just decided that's too much. We're not going to approve any more New Deal programs. There was one more New Deal law passed in 1938 after this. You guys are all familiar with this, so you probably don't realize where it came from, but I suspect that every one of you who's ever had a job has benefited from the minimum wage. So in 1938, the minimum wage law was passed, and so now you have a federal minimum wage that all employers who fell underneath federal authority had to pay at least that much, okay? Federal minimum wage. And so when today's politicians on the Democratic side talk about $15 an hour, or some talk about $20 an hour, or whatever it is, they're talking about the federal minimum wage, and that they want to raise that minimum wage, right? And they're able to do that because of the 1938 minimum wage law. Okay. Most of the New Deal programs, however, did eventually end, especially those designed to get the economy out of the Great Depression. Social Security was not designed to get the economy out of the Great Depression. It was designed to be an insurance program, a retirement program for old people for as long as the United States continued to exist. See the difference? But PWA was designed to put people to work and build things, WPA, et cetera, et cetera. Those programs will end. They will end in the early 1940s when what happens? Now, when the Second World War begins, these works programs are not needed anymore, folks. You have a massive new works program. You know what it's called? The United States Army, yes, or the Navy, right? And then, of course, all the factories that need workers in order to build the weapons for the Second World War. No PWA needed, no WPA needed, see? No unemployment problems anymore because of the war. And then we'll go from a little bit of deficit spending, relatively speaking, in the middle of the New Deal, to massive deficit spending in order to pay for the war. Okay? And this will jumpstart the economy, and when the war was over in 1945, the economy in the United States just kept on roaring, okay, right into the modern era. And you all benefited from that. And so it was the war, eventually, deficit defense spending, that ended the Great Depression. That's as important a question as I can ask. Okay? Deficit defense spending. Fears and hopes. The New Deal is one of the most important programs in American history. And so historians argue about the New Deal. Politicians argue about the New Deal. In assessing Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, we must remember how desperate the American people had become by 1932. Farmers across the country in 1932 were near revolt. It was not unusual when there was an auction because a farm went bankrupt, and the sheriff came out and conducted an auction, going to sell off all the equipment, going to sell off the farm. So farmers and investors and bankers from all around the area, hundreds of people would show up at this auction. It was not unusual for friends of the farmers to show up with shotguns and deer rifles and axes and baseball bats and ropes to intimidate somebody from out of town from bidding on that farm. Near revolt, you see, 1932. Things have changed by 1936. In the cities in 1932, social radicals, primarily the Communist Party, found willing ears to listen. Things are difficult. Times are tough. It looks like the world economic system is falling apart. Communism has the answer, you see. And so the communists were clear that they were there to save the country. On a spring day in 1930 in New York City, 35,000 Americans gathered to hear communist speakers. And then there was radio priest, Father Coughlin, Catholic priest. He stirred the hearts of millions over the radio with his version of anti-Semitism and fascism. And in the next section of the class, when we're talking about the Second World War, I'll explain what fascism is, okay? There's a lot of confusion about what fascism is today. You don't like somebody in the American political system, they're a fascist, right? We will all know what fascism is. Radio priest Father Coughlin had a version of American fascism and certainly racism. But thankfully, most Americans did not want a revolution. They wanted the capitalist system fixed. And Franklin Roosevelt tried to do that. Roosevelt was a firm believer in capitalism and the idea that America was basically on the right path. He also believed that the federal government must help restore what was wrong with the country. Free enterprise, that is absolute free enterprise, politicians and economists think there's no role for the federal government to act. Just leave the system alone. It'll fix itself. Okay? The only thing the federal government can do for those who believe in absolute free enterprise is mess things up, make it worse. All right? Roosevelt rejects that. He says, no, the federal government can act and should act to make things better. The government can help restore what's wrong with the country. So the basic philosophy of the New Deal, was that the federal government not only could, but must help improve the lives of the American people. And any political system, economic system we are talking about here, the continuum that I was mentioning earlier, what differs these systems is how much you use the central or federal government. The communist system, it is all about control from the central government, the communist government, right? It controls everything. And in the complete free enterprise system, it controls nothing. Okay? It's buyer beware. Survival of the fittest. Most Americans are somewhere in between. See? Roosevelt is saying the federal government can do something to help. He's a firm believer in capitalism. But once you understand that our political economic debate is about how much use of the federal government we're going to approve, then you're a long ways towards understanding the debate. So why wouldn't you just have the government fix everything, own everything, and decide everything? Why wouldn't you do that? Because that means no freedom whatsoever. And the American people have always valued freedom. And then I would add, if you put a small group of people, and that's communism, a small group of people in charge, who's going to benefit? The small group of people are going to benefit for sure, you see. Right? And you're not going to be able to say anything one way or the other because you don't have any freedom to voice your opinion. So that's why we don't do that. But the American people have also rejected the other extreme of no government control whatsoever because we did actually see that working, and we found that the rich got very rich, and those who had very little could barely feed themselves, you see. And what was wrong with that? You had maximum freedom. Maximum freedom. Well, as long as you were rich. You didn't have a whole lot of freedom, though, or any equality if you weren't, you see. So the American people have decided to try to combine the two, so you have a lot of freedom and more equality. And it's just about adjusting the mix. FDR knew that the government must act. Even if its actions were not always effective, and yes, some New Deal programs did not work. NRA is a classic example. But it must act so as to rebuild hope, confidence, optimism amongst the American people. For without that, we will give ourselves over to some radical solution, some Pied Piper, you see, who tells us just vote for him and everything will be fine. And of course, many of the government's programs in the 1930s meant the difference between life and death for Americans, between misery and comfort, between optimism and despair. Most importantly, FDR's action provided hope. The economy is getting better. In his fireside chats on the radio, he came into the living rooms of Americans and he lifted their spirits and he explained what the government was doing and what the problems were and how they were trying to fix it. And though the Depression lingered through the decade, the worst had passed in 1933. Now, Americans in 1936 don't know if it's going to get worse again or whatever, but in 1936 it clearly was better than it was in 32, 33, you see. And Americans trusted the father figure, the grandfather figure in the White House. They believed that he was doing everything he could. Within what? Within the parameters of the democratic capitalist system. It's not a socialist. It's not a communist. Not a fascist. The creation of this hope and faith was FDR's greatest accomplishment. His greatest gift to the nation. For this faith in American principles, freedom, democracy, capitalism, was what turned away the radical solutions that other nations at this time, in the midst of the Great Depression, which was worldwide, were moving towards. Germany. Oh, get rid of this democratic government. It's killing us. Adolf Hitler is our solution. Italy, even before that, Benito Mussolini. And Japan moved away from democracy towards a militaristic oligarchy, a leader of a government by a few, all military officers, whether they were admirals or generals. See? Moved away from democracy and towards dictatorship. This is what's going to bring on the Second World War, you see. Comes out of the genesis of the Great Depression. But in America, the American people would not trade their democratic capitalism for a tyranny of either the left or the right. They were committed. As long as it seemed to be getting better, they were committed to freedom and equality. Criticism. In undertaking such a monumental task, FDR ran into substantial criticism. That is life, folks. You might as well know it now. If your primary goal in life is to avoid criticism, do nothing. Does that sound like a good plan for the future? I'm not going to do anything. Okay, you won't be criticized. Until your parents get wind of it, and then they'll criticize you for what? Doing nothing. And rightly so. Get some guts. I don't know about you, but I decided a while back that if I was going to be criticized no matter what I did, and I was going to do what I thought was right. I was going to do what I thought God called me to do. And then if they want to criticize, fine. I can live with that. So let's not worry about criticism that much, okay? So FDR runs into all kinds of criticism. And he still does. Much of it not fair. He's not there to defend himself anymore, right? Oh, you socialist. Oh, you fascist. Criticism from the radical left, from the communists and socialists. Yes, they're going to criticize FDR. One reason we know he wasn't a socialist. The true socialists hated him. They said to him, "You're not doing enough." You have to be able to understand this. So you hear somebody criticize FDR, do they criticize him from the left or do they criticize him from the right? You have to know enough about this era and about politics in general to understand that. They said, those from the radical left said, "You're not doing enough. You should have done more." For example, you had the opportunity in the midst of the banking crisis to nationalize the banks, take over the entire banking system, and run the banks as part of the federal government. You see? That's what the left would have wanted. Take it over. Make them federal banks. Take over the utilities, run them as part of the federal government. Take over the steel industry, take over the railroads, run them all as part of the that's socialism / communism, okay? He doesn't do any of that. He regulates them, but they're still privately owned. So that was the criticism from the left. You should have done more. I used a phrase the other day. The left said that the New Deal was a Band-Aid on a heart attack. Not enough, see? And then the right, the conservatives, what did they say? This is Herbert Hoover now. Remember the lecture from the other day? Herbert Hoover said if you went down this path, you would be taking the American people to socialism. Too much. You're doing too much. Too much federal government. Leave it alone. It'll fix itself. So, criticized from either side. But look at the electoral map of 1936. What did most Americans think? They said to both the radicals on the left and the radicals on the right, "You are crazy." And they voted Roosevelt, didn't they? Overwhelming. So how did the Depression end? We already know. Just to reiterate. So there can be no doubt that 1933, looking back on it, was the worst of the hard times. From that point on, the nation lurched and sputtered. Don't think of it being obvious, especially month to month, that we're headed in the right direction. Some months were better than others, but looking back on it, certainly after 4 years, you could see that, okay, things were a lot better by 1936. Okay? And then if we look at a graph of the economy, looking back at it from this distance, we can see clear improvement. See? And that's why the American people voted as they did. 1933, though, the nadir, great word, low point, the nadir of the Depression. And now in 1937, Roosevelt, a conservative at this moment, see, Roosevelt was very concerned about deficit spending. If you put Roosevelt in the modern economic, political situation where we have $1 trillion deficit, he'd probably die of a heart attack. $1 trillion deficit? How conservative is he? In 1937, he's worried about deficit spending, so he pulls back on the throttle. Not so much. What happened to the economy? Without that federal money going into the economy starts to nosedive. It's called the Roosevelt recession of 1937. Yeah, he tried to do the responsible thing. It was too soon. And so the economy goes into the so-called Roosevelt recession in the midst of the Great Depression. He quickly realizes that that had been a mistake, and he begins to deficit spend again, and the economy begins to chug on out of it again. Now, by the end of the decade, by 1940, when the problems in Europe and the Far East began to cast a shadow over the United States, the Depression still lingered, but conditions were clearly much better. Then when it became obvious that trouble was likely on the way, defense spending rose. We started to spend money for defense in 1939, a little bit more in 1940, and then a lot more in 1941. When you are spending that money on the weapons and so forth, and by the way, we started the draft in 1940 so that we would start bringing men into the armed forces. A lot of those men were unemployed. We're putting more men to work in the factories and then eventually women in the factories. That's going to end unemployment. That's going to eventually end the economic crisis, isn't it? You bet. We began to respond to what we're seeing in the world in the late 30s, you see, with the rise of Nazi Germany and Japan. And so Americans are reemployed by the end of 1941, and the Depression is over in 1941 because of deficit defense spending. Unfortunately, the conditions which gave rise to this end of the Great Depression, that's the good news, right? Now we're going to end up in a war, the Second World War, and that is going to cost 400,000 Americans their lives. 400,000. It's going to change America forever, not only here at home, but in the world. Much of that for the good. Much of it for the good. But it is going to be devastating for the American people in terms of the losses. But frankly, they had no choice. No choice at all. So what's the legacy of the New Deal? The New Deal had made a significant change in America, in our government and in our economic system. But I argue that it was a change of degree, not a radical break from the past. It was a change of degree, not a change of kind. The conservatives, of course, argued that it was a radical change and that we are now headed down the wrong way. It's a change of kind, okay? Herbert Hoover, etc. And the radicals on the left, they wanted a change of kind, but they didn't get it as far as they were concerned. They wanted to have America remade in the image of the Soviet Union or some other communist/socialist state. They didn't get it. See? Yes, there's change, lasting change, significant change. But in my opinion, and historians again disagree on this, change of degree, not kind. You see, the New Deal did not end democracy. It did not end freedom. It provided more of both to the majority of the American people. Yes, some Americans had to give up some of their freedom to run their businesses as they saw fit. That's true. But the majority of the American people thought that was a fair trade. Because of the New Deal, it was possible to make a reasonable living on an American farm. It was possible to make a reasonable living in an American factory as a blue-collar worker. In many ways, the New Deal was the beginning of modern America. The heart of the New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt's vision for America. He was, and I quote, outraged by hunger and unemployment, as though they were personal insults in a world he was sure that the federal government could make better, just given a chance. In short, and again I quote, he wanted a better life for all Americans and a better America to live in. Questions? Questions? Yes.
Sorry, I missed the last one.
You're going to have to give me a question, though, about... Okay, so what did Roosevelt want? He wanted to improve America, okay, within the democratic capitalist system. He wanted to make a better America for all Americans. Okay. Yes. All right, this is great. This is on the test, folks. What is FDR's most important accomplishment? Hope. What's the title of your text? Land of Hope. It kind of fits together. That was kind of unintended, but just the way it worked out. All right. Yes, it's hope. It's the most important thing. Change of psychology, right? Okay, anybody else? Any other questions? All right, let's go over these. Which one of these is America? Which one most closely describes America? Democratic capitalism. How many think democratic capitalism? Raise them high. All right, we got some disagreements here. All right, somebody else with a different interpretation or point of view. Be bold. I didn't see everybody's hand up there. All right, raise them again. How many think democratic capitalism? All right, because if I don't see your hand up, I'm going to call on you. There's incentive to vote, right? Okay. It's like Russian volunteers. You, and you. Let's go. All right, sorry about a little World War II joke there. All right, so which one of these, okay, and so why do we study history? Let's go back to the very beginning. Why do we study history? So we can learn from the past. That's pretty good. So that we can make sense of the present, right? Okay? So if we're not going to make sense of the present, if it's just memorizing stuff from the past with no possible earthly good for the present, you are wasting your time and money. Okay? I agree with you. So it's got to have relevance. So let's make it relevant. Which of these is likely now on the ballot in November, in addition to democratic capitalism? Socialism. How so? What? It's not illegal. Okay, well, communism's not illegal either, folks. Okay? Healthcare what? Okay, what does that mean? Why is that socialism? All right, so you could have universal health care, couldn't you? And not be socialism? If everybody had a private health plan, okay? Now, you could have that. But what's on the ballot from several of the candidates on the Democratic Party is social health care, all right? Socialism health care. That is the government. It's called Medicare for All, more specifically, single payer. What does single payer refer to? Who's the single payer in a single payer healthcare system? Thank you. The federal government, okay? So the idea is you get rid of the private healthcare industry. Private insurance companies, hospitals aren't going to be privately owned. Pharmaceutical companies not going to be privately owned. They're all going to be owned and operated by the government, okay? That is single payer healthcare, like some systems in some other, especially European countries, okay? What's the benefit of that? What? What's the benefit? Okay, free health care, right? We'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. Everybody's covered. Is everybody covered in America now? No, everybody's not covered in America, right? Everybody's not. So everybody would be covered. Is that more equality or less? It would be more equality, okay? So there's the main basis behind it. And then, and this is uncertain, but the argument is that your healthcare costs, even if you do have healthcare now, will go down, okay? Because everybody's involved and the government's going to dole out the healthcare. You see the lack of freedom here? Government's going to decide who gets the healthcare, right? And how much you get and so forth, right? All right, so now it's advertised as free healthcare. Does Bernie Sanders believe that it's going to be free? What does he say? I'm just asking you to tell me what Bernie Sanders is telling the American people. It's going to be free when you walk in the door of the hospital or the doctor, right? Single payer, and it's not you, it's the government, okay? But you still have to pay for it. And this is where free gets really confusing. I've listened to this before, there are people all over the country who argue with people who are telling them that you're going to have to pay for it at some point, and then they say, but it's free, but it's free, but it's free. Don't you get it? It's free. Oh, no, don't you get it? Bernie tells us he's going to do what with taxes?
90%.
Yeah, taxes are going to go up astronomically.
90% taxes.
Yeah, okay, all right. So, and that's for the wealthy, okay, for the wealthy. But he's also going to bring income taxes down to, if I'm not mistaken here, but the last number I heard was $29,000 a year, which is just a little bit above minimum wage. So people who aren't paying any federal taxes now are going to have to pay federal taxes in order to pay for free health care. All right. Does everybody understand this? So your taxes are going to go up, pretty much no matter who you are, but when you walk through the door, the idea is that it's free, okay? And everybody can walk through the door, okay? All right. I just want you to understand. See, so now how about, and this is very close to my heart. Well, frankly, healthcare is close to my heart too. But this is even more close to my heart. The other thing that Bernie and the Democrats want to do, most of the Democrats, I shouldn't say all of them, is free college. Okay? How does that sound? Does that sound pretty good? Yeah, okay. Free college for who? Where, actually, is a better question. Where is free college going to be? Thank you. Public schools. All right, separation of church and state, George Fox is not going to get any of that money. And as a student who wants to go to George Fox or Lewis and Clark or Whitman or wherever you want to go, you're not going to be able to go to those private, and most Christian, well, all Christian schools are private, okay? You're not going to be able to go there without money, right? So if George Fox is now competing with the University of Oregon and they're free, or any other state school, and we're not, what's going to happen to attendance at George Fox? Most likely. Yeah, it's going to go down. And a lot of Christian colleges are already closing all over the country, okay? Concordia, Portland, just closed. Marylhurst, a year or two ago, closed, see? So that means there's only going to be a handful of Christian colleges left that survive it, if that happens. So what I said, it was close to my heart, it's pretty close to my wallet as well. Fortunately for me, retiring anyway, right? But that's free college. Now, is free college free college? Again, you don't have to pay as you walk into the University of Oregon, but your taxes are going to go up, and you're going to pay the rest of your life. Okay? You're just going to pay the rest of your life, you see. So I don't know whether paying off $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 in student loans was going to be cheaper or not, but you're going to pay, and the better job you have, the more you're going to pay the rest of your life, see. Okay. That is the reality. Free in this world is not free, okay? It's never free. It's actually irresponsible at the very least to use that term free. And to his credit, and I'm not advertising for him, but I just want to point out he doesn't do that. Bernie Sanders says he is going to raise your taxes, and that's how he's going to pay for it, okay? He says it, so credit to him for being honest, all right? All right, so socialism is on the ballot, more than likely, right? One form or another. Even if it's not Bernie who's the head of the ticket, you're going to have a Democratic candidate who is sympathetic to some of these ideas anyway, right? Okay. Very good. Now, communism. Can you think of a communist state in the world today or in the last century? North Korea is still a communist state, okay? Can anybody describe the standard of living in North Korea? We believe that well over 1 million, maybe 2 million people have starved to death in North Korea over the last number of years, all right? Yeah, okay. I know there's lots of reasons for that, but the political system, economic system is certainly one of them. Okay, so another communist state. Cuba, okay, again, the standard of living there. Not real high, okay. On the positive side, Cuba makes every effort to educate every single citizen. They have a single-payer healthcare system, right? But a lot of Cubans over the last, since 1959, 1960, have left Cuba and risked their lives to get out, and a lot of them live in the southern part of the United States, especially Florida, right? Okay, so they voted with their feet, is what I'm saying, okay? Other communist states. Vietnam, until relatively recently, when Vietnam decided that communism didn't work really well. And so then they began to change their system to a free market, a more free market system. What's the economy done in Vietnam since they made that change? Better or worse? Dramatically better. Okay, dramatically better. Other states like that. Okay, Russia was the premier communist state from 1922 to 1991, Soviet Union, okay? And finally, that system collapsed because it did not economically work. That's what we mean by a failed communist state. Exhibit A, Soviet Union. Okay. Another one, China. Okay, China, late 70s, 1980, decided to change the economic system from communism to a more free market system. What's happened since then in China? Dramatically higher, right? Dramatically, so that now, the People's Republic of China, still technically communist, and that is the Communist Party still controls it without the communist economic system, okay? So that's working pretty good for the economy of China. It's now the second most powerful economy in the world, whereas when they started about 1980, they were way down there on the ash heap of history, okay? So they rejected communism as an economic system, not as a political system, and they have done better, okay? All right, so the free enterprise capitalism. Where's the great example of that in the history of the world? Pretty much the United States in the middle of the 19th century, okay? That's what this class has been about. Gradually, the American people decided, you know what? That free enterprise capitalism isn't working well enough for all of us, so what do we have to do? Make changes, and what do we use to make the changes? The federal government, okay? And in making those changes, what does the federal government do? Just basic. Yeah, pass laws, okay? Regulations saying to business people in this case, you cannot do that anymore. The first great example of this is 1887. We talked about this the first week of class. The Interstate Commerce Commission. In 1887, we created the Interstate Commerce Commission. What's it going to do? It regulates commerce of one major industry. What industry was that? Railroads. Because most of the commerce of the country moved on railroads, unlike today. But you regulate railroads in those days, you go a long ways towards regulating what a business person who owns a railroad can charge his customers, you see. The idea is fair. Not going to be as much if we had that system down there at the bottom. You're going to have to lower your rates and charge a more fair rate. You're still going to own your own business. You're still going to make money, hopefully. But you're not going to be able to charge monopolistic prices, okay? And so the American people, beginning in 1887, good enough start date, I guess, started to say, let's make some adjustments using the federal government. So then they'd pass the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. No monopolies, right? At least that's the idea. And then you get the progressive movement where you get all kinds of laws, all kinds of regulations and programs and so forth to control that free enterprise capitalism. Make America more egalitarian without going all the way to the top system, right? Or the second system. So you end up with number 3, democratic capitalism. You've got the government controlling and regulating various aspects of the country. For most of our history then, since the turn of the 20th century, the debate was always about how much of number 3, but always within number 3. A little bit more, a little bit less, okay? Now we are actually on the precipice of saying, number 3 is not good enough. We need number 2. Okay? That is a change in American history. Number 2 is really on the ballot now. Does everybody understand this? God bless you all.